So, a friend of mine linked me this meme showing how game developers are in such a bad situation these days they could lose their jobs at the drop of a hat, no matter whether they made something that flopped or was a huge success, referencing the complete disaster that was Concord, but also these posts by people who had worked on Marvel Rivals and had been laid off despite that game being a big success. I looked through some comments and everyone seemed to be under the impression that NetEase had just laid off the game director for Marvel Rivals and the entire team right after they made the game such a big hit. Naturally, since Marvel Rivals is the new big thing, the Overwatch killer, and now the biggest provider of SFNs, I got curious and looked into the story. I started seeing tweets and even gaming news headlines that made it sound like the entire main team that had built the game got fired despite the massive success. Things like Marvel Rivals game director and his team have just been laid off. Marvel Rivals topped 40 million players before US developers were laid off. YouTube also has a bunch of reaction videos like Marvel Rivals layoffs show the dark side of gaming. This is trash. Marvel Rivals game director fired. Stuff like that. Some creators are just reacting to the headlines and viral tweets without doing any deeper research, and others are actively playing into the outrage cycle because, let's be honest, that's what gets clicks. At first, I believed the worst. I'd heard about big companies making nonsensical layoffs before, tanking their own reputations, and eventually hurting their own games in the process. But why would they do this? Is this story, the headlines implied, really what's happening here? Like, sure, NetEase is a massive corporation. It's easy to think of big companies as soulless entities that treat the people who work for them as expendable game pieces to be thrown away at a whim if they think it'll make number go up. But Marvel Rivals is doing really well. It's brand new, and it's a live service, probably with tons of new content in the pipelines for the next couple of years. What sense would it make for them to fire the people directly responsible for the game's success, without some other major factor being at play? It didn't add up. So I started digging deeper. And what I mean is digging deeper than popular tweeters and journalists by spending 5 minutes on Google. And what I found out, after just a bit of basic searching, is that most of those tweets and headlines were overly dramatic, stretching what little they knew. Here's what was known on that first day with all those dramatic headlines. An American game director working in a studio in Seattle affiliated with NetEase posted that he and his team had been laid off. This was the primary information that loads of tweets and headlines were based on, and plenty of them made it sound like this was the main team that had created Marvel Rivals. And what was easy to find out online that some of these tweeters and journalists didn't even mention was that this game director in the headlines was actually just the head of one small overseas studio, and not the overall creative lead for Marvel Rivals. The main game director, Guanyuan Chen, the person actually leading the project, wasn't laid off and is still working on the game in China. And there were some things that weren't in the tweets or articles I saw, and I couldn't even find on Google at the time. Such as, what's the name of the studio that got shut down? None of the articles even mentioned it. And what was that studio actually working on for NetEase? I saw some Reddit posts suggesting it was a localization team, but the studio director's LinkedIn described him as a level designer. And also how many people were laid off in total. Later information suggested that the team that got laid off was only 6 people, while the full Marvel Rivals dev team is massive. None of the so-called journalists reporting at this had even actually spoken with anyone from NetEase before publishing those first articles. And at that point, I'm realizing some of these viral posts from random people on Twitter might have just been ignorant and jumping the gun, but the professional journalists writing the headlines must have found the same vague information that I did at the time, including what was actually known and what was unknown. And instead of clarifying things, they chose to make it sound like the worst possible version of events. It's obvious why content creators and so-called journalists do what they do with misleading posts and headlines. And I can understand why we keep falling for it, especially in situations like this where it looks like some greedy corporation is screwing over the very people who made them successful. It plays into tropes about big corporations that we kind of believe even without knowing what the company does. Like, what is NetEase anyway? They're most well known now for Marvel Rivals, but there's so much more than that. Aside from making video games, they also do e-commerce. They run advertising. They handle cloud services. And they run pig farms. I'm not joking. NetEase is not only out here managing video games and shopping and cloud computing, But they've gotten so into pig farming and breeding that they produce over 500,000 hogs every year. But the point is, with all that, people already see NetEase as this giant faceless corporation that's probably easy to hate. So when they see headlines implying that they just fired the entire team of Marvel rivals, it fits the narrative that people already believe. And most people don't even bother to fact check things that confirm what they already think, or even they're just such a shocking story they're too good to check. It's easy to see a tweet, get mad, and hit retweet or comment. It's easy to assume the worst and hold on to that first impression. But if you really care about this stuff, you have to stop taking viral headlines at face value. One of the reasons this particular story spread so quickly is due to people's desire to take the side of the underdog game developers against their unfair bosses. But part of the reaction I saw in comment sessions was people saying that they'll boycott Marvel Rivals now because of how NetEase punished their workers. Now, Twitter boycotts usually aren't a big deal, but still, considering that the main team is still employed and continuing to work on the game, if there had been action against the game, it could have ended up leading to more layoffs and hurting game devs thanks to journalists trying to get outrage clicks. It sucks whenever anyone gets laid off from a successful project through no fault of their own, but making the situation sound worse than it is isn't helping them or any of their former co-workers who are still there. So next time you see a story like this, pause for a second. Ask yourself, where's the information coming from? Does it make sense? What's the evidence? Because the truth is, most people aren't going to check. They don't have time for it. They'll see something shocking, get upset over it, and spread it further. If you're still watching this, you don't have to be like them. In fact, you should make an effort to not be like that. Clickbait and bad journalism thrive on people spreading misinformation for free. If you don't do that, if you take an extra minute to check things before repeating them, or even just have some restraint on spreading things before you know more, you're already doing better than half the internet.